I'm Eric Barden.
I'm Amy Barden.
And welcome to another episode of Bombardened.
Today we are talking to my favorite colleague in the alternative response space. I just realized I probably angered like 30 others, but whatever.
Well, each one of them is your favorite in their own special way. Yes.
No. So this is Mariela Ruiz-Angel, who set up Albuquerque Community Safety, really created something out of nothing overnight. Exceptional leader, exceptional visionary. She talks a lot about community, about doing right by community, and advocating for the needs, especially of displaced or marginalized communities, while also being very supportive of first responders in law enforcement and in the fire department. So she got that thing launched. She got it scaled. Today it's run by Jody Escobel, is the director, another fabulous leader. They're so lucky to have her.
Also your favorite.
That's when we interview Jody, she'll be my favorite that day. Yes. And now Mariela's at Georgetown. She's running a research collective that I'm a part of with a few other jurisdictions. And together what we're trying to do is map out the blueprint, right? In first response, how do you build out that continuum? What language should we be using? I've become a loud advocate that it should be general funded, that we need to treat community responders like first responders rather than having these little grant infusions and we do a little pilot and then fail to scale it and try another little pilot. We're trying to get away from that.
Well, I think what's really interesting is that while this is currently a movement across the globe, particularly here in the United States and Canada, alternative response is here to stay.
Yeah.
And yet, it only started just a few years ago, and Mariela was at the tip of the spear. You got on board shortly thereafter and have been a powerhouse. You guys are both heavy hitters in the space. It's fantastic to have her as a guest to sort of talk about where it started and where we're at and where we're headed in terms of alternative response, and how important it is to have the continuum of care available in a first response capacity.
I agree. Let's go.
Let's do it. Prepare to be bombarded. Well, welcome to another episode of Bombardened. We are delighted to have Mariela with us today, an absolute beast in the space of alternative response, along with my beautiful wife, Amy, who fortunately introduced me to Mariela. And the thing we love best about Mariela is that she is a plain speak, no BS gal who's going to tell it like it is. See, I'm setting you up. I don't want you to don't get like politically correct on me,
side.
Right? And she's fantastic and has a lot of experience building these programs from the ground up. So, really looking forward to our discussion today.
I remember when I introduced you to, do you remember it was at IACP, Mariela, and you came out to meet us? I was with like the mayor's office and the police chief and all the command staff. And they were used to me. I had been around for like 6 months and thought that I was okay. And then after they met you, they were like, you're fine, Amy, but this gal. So
literally, I was all, why are you hanging out with these people? I was like, let's go do something else. I was all, come on, let's just bounce this. I was all, we don't want to hang out with these folks. And she was like, no, making friends. And I was like, oh, I'm so proud of her for making friends. But also I was all, let's go hang out with our friends.
Yep. Let's blow this joint. I know it is funny that sort of the policing world and the alt response world. And then there's like the co-response world. So we got to go back to the beginning. You, I think like 30 days into the job, became my work best friend. We won't tell Ryan and Andrew. And you were, in my opinion, like the first visionary to actually get momentum in the movement of alternative response, to get stuff done in a way that it would be very hard to unwind. And so will you talk to us? I actually don't even know your background. What is the professional background and how did you wind up in that job?
So interestingly enough, I was in corporate relationships prior to being a social worker. I was in my 20s. I wanted money. I wanted to travel. I wanted to do all the things that 20-year-olds do. I grew up in I wouldn't say poverty because it never felt like we were poor, but it's also because people that we lived around were probably poorer than we were. So, when you put the two together, you don't feel it as much.
Everything's relative, right?
It's all right. We didn't know like that, just like people ate real ice cream from Baskin Robbins. We were just like, you get what you get at the little like tiendita, where you got the 25-cent candy. So it was, growing up with a single mom who also was she herself was a social worker working for vulnerable populations at the time, deaf, hard of hearing, and blind individuals. Myself and my sister grew up in an environment in which helping people was not necessarily taboo. It was like you went out of your way to pick up the person who was walking up the street with the groceries and take them home. Maybe you don't do that now, but back then it was very normal to go out of your way to help people, to spend your weekend at an event with blind children, to guide older people, right? Those were things we did growing up. And it was where I probably cut my teeth in a lot of the experience and work I did with communities. Fast forward, like I said, I thought success was money and all the things that come with that. And turns out it's not. After I had to lay off and be a part of layoffs, I was like, this job sucks. And I was 29 and decided to take some time off to travel. And I was in Indonesia. It was kind of my epiphany moment. And I'd had a series of kind of like weird accidents, surfing and swimming in the ocean. And I had this moment where I was like, I just need to step out of my travel mode and go do something with the people here. And I found myself at a woman and children's kind of shelter, homestay. And I just asked if I could volunteer to like teach kids. And it was like, I loved it so much that I started to do that in every place I went. Every like location, I would seek out places where I could volunteer and help. And probably after about 2, maybe 3 months of doing that, I just thought, I'm ready to go home and change my entire career. So I came back, I got a master's in social work. I got a master's in human resource, kind of a dual program. And at the time I was just looking for a in-between job. Like I didn't know what my career was going to look like, but I thought, I hear the city's kind of cool, and started working for the legislature, got connected into the city and became a contractor. And fast forward, I had helped create our Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, which we actually stole the model from Seattle. And then that turned into creating an Office of Equity and Inclusion with a beautiful team and a director at the time who had this really amazing vision. And then fast forward, COVID happened, and I was asked to help do emergency response for communities in crisis during that time, and doing a lot of feeding and just helping get people connected. And that's about George Floyd moment, right? After the murder of George Floyd, there was this like pivotal space where they were like, hey, you've done all this cool work. Do you want to create this program? Yeah. And so that is kind of like the very beginning of how I ended up in all these pieces, right, over my entire life that led to this moment of like, okay, like, let's see what this looks like. I have no idea. At the time, they had no idea. They were calling it a Department of Social Workers. Mm-hmm. I actually think some people thought it was going to be like Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, Cross Guards. And we just went with it. We started the community engagement process. We started all of it.
What was the original version? I mean, was it co-located and working alongside law enforcement, or was it a standalone, or what was the first iteration?
The first iteration was to be under the fire department, which some models have already taken to that. And we actually thought it'd be a great one, but we were in the middle of an election, and I think the fire chief at the time was like very much opposed to that. They were like, this is just a political ploy. We're not interested in being dragged through the mud. As you know, fire unions are very strong. So that stopped pretty quickly. And that's how we kind of decided, let's just try this as its own department. It was like we got backed into it with support. We still got really great support from police and fire in regards to operational pieces, but the idea was that we would stand alone. And so interesting enough, though, fast forward, years later, people were like, why didn't you just go under the fire department? And I was like,
hey, good idea. Yeah, I wish we'd have thought of that, right?
Yeah. No, was Chief Medina in place when you started?
So Chief Medina was in place when I had started, and we had played in the same sandbox many times, right? Work around immigrants and work around a lot of the police work, right? Trying to get language access into the police department. But I'd already had really great relationships more with his mid-level and deputy level officers. And so it was natural that like eventually when him and I started playing in the same space that we were both kind of like, do we like each other? Are we like, can we trust each other? And so, and immediately like our first trip, to go share all the good things we were doing in Albuquerque was like very natural that we just hit it off. So,
for folks that don't know, Harold Medina is the chief in Albuquerque and an innovator, progressive thought leader, and old style, cop's cop at the same time. So he's really one of the most progressive thought leaders in law enforcement in the country, and a great guy. And the two of you together are formidable, to say the least.
We are. We're and we're at good times. So, to say the least, we really enjoyed. I really enjoyed working with him, and we'll always have good thoughts about him. Just personally. So
tell me about your interactions with labor early on. And, again, the police chief's role in getting buy-in, because it's interesting now. If it's funny, it feels like a million years ago when you started. I remember, I think you were 2 years in when you and I met, and you were like, Amy, I'm tired. I was 2 weeks in. I was like, why? And now I am tired. It is really exhausting. But some of it is this, intractability around what if a social worker gets shot? What about unarmed responders? And, I'm always like, I dispatch fire all the time. They're unarmed. We've done this forever. We know how to do this. So tell me your experience getting consensus and buy-in and political alignment.
So, we did have the kind of early on 2020, defund the police movement definitely was a damper on a lot of the programming we were trying to create nationally, because we weren't about defending the police. We know that there is a total place for police to live in, and we want to support that. But we also don't necessarily need for police to be the centralized only public safety thing, right? And we center all of our public safety around police. And I couldn't tell you how many police officers we were seeing leave, and we were seeing, just like exhausted and like starting to get jaded, who had just been like, I don't want to do it. And it was telling, because when we started ACS, I was getting police officers applying, leaving their 25-year pension to come to a 30-year pension. And I was like, are you sure you want to do it? And they're like, I'm literally going to be doing my job, but without handcuffs and a gun, and I still and I get to go home on time, and I don't have to do overtime. I'm in.
And without the public vitriol. Because you remember my first ride along in Albuquerque was with an ex-cop. And it was fascinating to me because I asked. He was exceptional. I learned a lot from him. But it really influenced my thinking around this first responder status, that we need to actually heighten and elevate this role alongside police and fire so that people can flow to the work they want to do.
And I think it's important to remember also, as sort of the context and backdrop to this thing, that, I started police work in the late 80s. That's how old I am. So in 1987, I was pushing a patrol car in downtown Seattle 8 at night to 4 in the morning. And at the time, it was, police were focused primarily both by virtue of the time and place that I was working. It was the heat of the crack war days, and downtown Seattle was virtually abandoned by business or working employed folks during the night hours. There's now condos and apartments and businesses everywhere that weren't there at the time, but a lot of boarded up buildings, frankly, at the time. But back then, law enforcement focused mostly on law breaking. That was what we spent our time doing. Over about the next 20 or 30 years, the areas of responsibility for law enforcement have crept and continue to creep in the direction of all things to all people. And that's not fair to law enforcement, because it's not like we don't still have crimes to respond to, but we've also become social workers and community activists and all types of different areas that, while it's great to skill us up in those areas for those moments in time where we are faced with that, we're not the best people to spend 2 or 3 hours getting somebody, socks and getting him transported and buying him, lunch or whatever the case may be, and getting them stabilized and perhaps getting them to treatment and those kinds of things. That's not the best use of police work. And yet that's the trend that we have been on, which I also want to note here that what you started, which you both recognize seems as not a long time ago, but at the same time, actually just a few years. And in those few years, this is now the movement across the country. And as we just learned at the Left Conference, internationally across the globe, this is the wave of the future. And yet you all just started it a few years ago. So that it's important to note that, but it's also important to recognize that this came, and I recognize that it's been negatively impacted by that defund movement perspective, but really it's a move back to law enforcement doing what they are absolutely best at, and other folks and social workers and crisis intervention specialists doing what they are the best at. So
we're like one show away from making that work. More like BS or AAC.
If we talk long enough.
And I think that going back to what you're saying, Eric, I mean, the reality is that I think when the union, we know that in a lot of places, the unions are like, this is going to kill people. And I think where Medina was really powerful, and not just Medina, but the administration at the time was like, look, you're going to have to let them do what they're going to do. And look, if they get shot and killed or they get hurt and killed, then look, you were right. You can just tell, like, see, I told you this wasn't going to work. And so there was a lot of stop, because cops would pull up to our calls. Yeah. It was all kinds of stuff. They'd be like, the cops just showed up. I'm like, keep on doing what you're doing. Don't worry about it. Let them see you do your job so they can understand what you do.
Build credibility.
So we did a lot of that. And eventually, also fast forward, eventually the union was like, hey, maybe those people should join our union because this seems like a growing industry of workers. Yeah. We did not go that route, but I will say that I think the relationship was very telling that this is about helping police morale. It was about helping police stay police focused. And to your point, I love the fact that when I go on a call where fire and police and ACS are present, there is such interesting collaboration, and everybody still stays in their lane and everybody still does what they're doing. And although it's like 3 brothers and sisters playing together and each has their own personality, it works. And I think that is what is even more amazing about this piece, and why I'm still a big believer that this has to almost be separate, because had we just been in fire, or had this been in police, you'd be too aligned with those entities, and then you'd be seen as the other, right? And I think this actually makes us very equal.
Yeah, that's a really good insight, because what I observe is the co-responder teams in police and fire departments, we've got 50 now across Washington state, they are subverted. They're not valued the way they should be at all. They're not invested in. I've bemoaned Seattle set up co-response in 2010. And when I went over to East Precinct to meet that team, I expected it to be 100 people, because I'm running 911. I can see in the call data, that is the unit you would need generally. Lots of calls that would indicate there's a mental health issue and a public safety issue. And it's 5 people, and I thought, okay, therein lies the issue, that we are not actually analyzing the calls for service and setting up the right first response.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important.
So why didn't you scale co-response, Eric?
Because after 2020 and George Floyd, I lost 400 officers. Yeah. That's why. We didn't have...
Well, that's exactly it, right? What we were finding was that although the co-responder model is really good, and in a lot of cases, probably the best model to go into these calls, 2 things were happening. 1, Eric, you said it. We didn't have enough cops to pair with a clinician. 2, We didn't have enough clinicians to pair with cops. And 3, I will actually say that I was losing clinicians faster than I could get them, because 10 hours in a car with 2 different personalities can be challenging all on its own. But then you add very different insights, it can be even harder. So, I will say that I think, and they weren't supported as much, right? Sometimes our clinicians don't speak the same language and the same culture. And so some of our clinicians who were embedded in our police department struggled. So this gave us a nice ability to ebb and flow in different ways and be flexible to meet people where they're at in their work journey.
I think one of the things that police unions have been concerned about is, oh my goodness, we're going to lose body of work and we're going to lose membership, and they won't need, because again, coming on the heels of the defund movement, there's this anxiety or concern about it. And yet in Albuquerque, ACS has responded to 100,000 calls, and I've not heard or seen any evidence to suggest that Albuquerque PD is running out of work. I mean, they're still pretty busy, right?
Not in the National Guard. What are you talking about?
Well, and I've heard Medina talk about the impact to morale, that morale improved dramatically as Albuquerque community safety started to scale. And I've quoted the crime statistics as well, because now there are national drops. That's the trend. But Albuquerque was turning things around far before that trend, right? Faster. When we were escalating, we saw property crime drop, violent crime drop. And I've said, I'm sure it's just because cops are free to do law enforcement work. I mean, that's probably the main thing, right?
Yeah, they
it
could
gets
get on
really
scene,
frustrating go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was saying they literally were like able to, you could see it in the call response times, right? They could get to the call and then immediately back out of that call. And so the data wasn't lying to us about freeing up space for cops to do what they're doing. So even the data showed to add to the morale.
And as a retired police executive, I can tell you it's really, really disheartening and frustrating to respond to legitimate concerns from the community asking for help and not having the resources to do it, while at the same time I know my cops are responding to person down calls with no threat of there's no violence associated, there's no weapons associated, there's no crime associated, and yet we're tying up cops' time. And when I can't address real ongoing community crime problems and public safety issues and disorder that I would be able to if I had more officers. So it truly is a win-win, and I think across the country, people are beginning to see that. I think there's always going to be that sort of introductory union sort of interaction that you're going to have to work through. But this, I believe, is the way of the future. I don't think there's any question about that. I don't think anybody's going, that doesn't seem like the obvious way forward. I think there's a consensus across the country that this is where we're going and we need to figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 100%.
Tell us about your role currently at Georgetown, running this research collective, because the intention I think that we all have is to get closer to a blueprint so that folks don't continually reinvent the wheel. You were so generous with me. I think the first time I went to Durham, I came back with their Google Drive. Everything Hart had tried, everything that had failed, all the different furlough lines, all the different policies, they just gave me the whole drive, which obviously I had to iterate, right? It didn't all apply, but there's so much generosity among practitioners. So tell me about your work today.
Yeah, so, after I left the city, I went to go I'm working at Georgetown Law as the director for alternative response initiatives, which someday we'll have to change that title to match what we actually do, and which is also a debacle. And interestingly enough, I walked into a 2-year research grant that Schusterman and Ford so generously paid for us to really start thinking about more of a veteran, right? The folks that have been doing this the longest, and to your point, Eric, not that long, but long.
We're veterans.
Yeah, you 3-year vets. Wow.
The 2020, 2021 vets.
Okay, 5 years. 5 years.
Yeah. But it was to really look at these cities in different models and versions to really start to think about what are we actually defining alternative response as? What is this new workforce that we're talking about? What does consent look like when we're actually thinking about consent?
So define it for us. That's a great question. Now, what is it?
Alternative
define
response?
it. Yes, define it.
So what we are seeing through our research, and not through, I'm going to just be really, really micro-focused because if I say that it's not going to conflict with the larger group, and by group, I mean everybody, all the research funders and practitioners. But what we're finding is that it is emergency response. It is emergency response to 911 calls. And it's a holistic, compassionate, accountability, right? Safe response to calls for 911. That is like the definition in my that diverts calls from 911 that do not need to necessarily
So non-police response to emergency and crisis circumstances.
One of the challenges
but we want to be careful. I want to say, like, people get really upset because they're like, well, what if it's not 911? They all do alternative too. And I'm like, the groups that we are focused on today are taking calls from 911. Yeah. And to us, that is a best practice because you don't have 2 or 3 people filtering, right, to then
the average citizen, when they see a problem, they only have to think of one number to call. They don't have to go, well, is this 988 or is this 911 or is this some other number?
211, 411.
Yeah. So, from a customer service perspective, allowing the professionals to delineate which route and what's the appropriate response is superior to the citizens' assessment of the situation.
Yeah, and I have a hell of a time articulating for people the difference between first response, that I'm talking about sending someone instead of a cop or a firefighter or EMS. This is a 911 first response. We are not outreach workers. We're not case managers. We're not the homeless response unit. We're not. It is, people are conflating all these different functions. So CVI is really important right now. So violence interruption, intervention work. We've got a lot of outreach teams out who are doing more like milieu management. And people are conflating those ideas with what I'm talking about. These are first responders. And I don't want them spending 4 hours on a call. Ideally, I want them to rapidly triage and hand off. And I feel
we're
like you
crisis.
Sort of, we're not mobile crisis.
For those that are involved in this, like, we know that people are like, mobile crisis is alternative. And I said, no, it's not, because that's a clinician who gets paid by Medicaid when you seek reimbursement to do a 4-hour evaluation, submit it, and you can maybe take 3 calls a day on a shift that's 10 hours. That is not okay, in my opinion.
That's right.
Both cities can take up to 8 to 9 calls a day if they're if they're really good, or they could be a long call. But the idea is that it's not a long call because you're spending time trying to coerce somebody into being evaluated. It's a long call because you need to be able to help somebody work through some real issues.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you remember when we met, I was so agnostic about design. I really was. I was a blank canvas, which I think was a significant advantage, actually, because I didn't show up with a lot of assumptions. I'm from the Portland area. I was aware of cahoots. I love our friend Anne, who talks about hippies in vans. It always cracks me up. It's such a great story. In Olympia PD, they were like, where are the hippies in vans? Because they were talking about this cahoots model. But I think I'm so uniquely anchored in 911 and 911 data that quickly began to inform my opinions, because I also got to see, you alluded to it earlier, the choreography on the front lines with first responders, how you can't actually bucket, like, this is a mental health call, this is a medical call, this is a criminal call. That is not a thing. Overwhelmingly, you're going to need at least 2 of those teams on calls. I would say it's probably 90% of the time, 2 of the 3, and sometimes all 3.
Yep. That's exactly it. And somebody, interestingly enough, it came up around training yesterday at that conference that we were at with Brookings. That was really about, like, how do you train? And I'm like, our academy trains all of it. Like, you don't get to omit, this piece or this piece, because you never know what you're walking into, because it's first response.
Right. Yeah.
Right? If it was secondary, then you might have an understanding that's like, I'm walking in and Bob's upset and Bob has, suicide ideation. But, like, sometimes the disposition doesn't, the details in the CAD don't tell us very much. And so we have to be trained on all these pieces for safety reasons and for knowledge on how to handle each situation differently. And so I do think that makes a big difference when we're talking about safety, right? And that is actually part of the whole connects with the union conversation, right? And why we even think about organizing. It's almost always about safety and how much money.
So
and I think that those are, go ahead.
So what is define for us what a successful call is? If it's an alternative response appropriate call and they respond as first responders with an expectation that they're not going to spend the rest of the day there. So an alternative responder that falls within the definition that you provided earlier. What's an example of a successful outcome of that call?
So I think it can be 1,000 different types of calls that you can go to. The idea is that you're getting somebody to a better place. So maybe somebody needs a very specific resource, or you've de-escalated a situation that doesn't need to go to the next level, and you hope that you never have to, and then you're still leaving people with resources, and you hope that you don't have to necessarily see them again. But we take the extra step to be able to follow up if we need to, right? To say, hey, we left you with resources about this yesterday. How is it going today with your child who was having this situation yesterday, right? Have you done the following steps? Suicide ideation is another big one, right? And you know this, Eric. Yeah. Suicide by cop is a real thing, and it happens often. And it is like one of the worst things to happen to a cop. I think it's got to be damaging emotionally and just mentally. And I think that one of the areas that we see is like how to recognize what that looks like and how not to barge in. Like, we don't need to necessarily like say, we're going to force this conversation. It's like, we need to wait and see how we can meet this person when they're ready to have the conversation. But I'm not going to send a cop into that because they're literally looking for that response.
Right. Exactly.
And I think those are the kind of things, right? You know this. I mean, you're a cop. Like, it's not setting anybody up for success. That's for sure. And we see lawsuits.
That's the co-response type circumstance. Because if there's a weapon involved, that would, if we believe that there's suicidal ideation and a weapon involved, that's something where you're going to need to have law enforcement there, in my view. You may also have a social worker or crisis intervention specialist, MHP, involved with that. And of course, police also have, what we call hostage negotiators, but are essentially de-escalation experts involved in that call. Because to your point, you don't want to be the impetus for a flashpoint where somebody ends up getting hurt or killed. So when there's weapons involved, for me,
escalated pretty quickly in your head. That literally went to like a SWAT situation in one sentence.
Well, when you're talking about, I can't tell you how many of these I've been on where the person, there's nobody more dangerous than somebody who doesn't care if they die and they're armed. And they're feeling like, acting out. That's a volatile situation, particularly when there's a weapon involved. But there's also a role for the mental health professional in that space, because you can de-escalate these things. And more often than not, they do. It's hard to tell how many don't because we didn't take the time or the effort or didn't have the right approach as we went into that deal.
Yeah, you don't know.
Well, I think the definition of imminent harm is going to be a really interesting definition for things, because like somebody could say, I want to kill myself with a gun and never actually have the gun. Mm-hmm. And again, I think if they're like looking for a suicide by cop, that's going to escalate it. We would never get sent to that call. But how often do we go to calls where we know people are packing and we still go to the calls because it wasn't reported in the call? I mean, you know this. That's the kind of stuff that I'm actually trying to define, is that even if this person is saying I want, and especially high utilizers, we have a whole group of people who are high utilizers, suicide ideation folks, don't actually kill themselves because what they're really looking for is a cop to do the shooting. And I think that is where this becomes a challenge. We're at phase 2. So I will tell you that I think part of where I'm starting to decide is, are we at the tipping point where we've proven ourselves to be capable?
Yep.
We've been safe. We followed all the rules. We know how to play in the CAD system. We know how to use the radios. We know how to do these things well. are we ready to start making the challenge, which will put us in another space where we'll have to challenge police to say, do you really need to go to that call? Or can we try to take it first?
Yeah. And I think what's really important to remind folks of is that we don't have any catastrophic stories. 100,000 calls in Albuquerque and
since 1987 though.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of calls elsewhere. And we don't have any of this, catastrophic incidents. So I think the test of time has proven that this is a very safe model when applied appropriately. So I want to ask you this. Of the voices in this space, what do you find the least helpful or detrimental? Because I
want to answer that.
I want to ask Mariela, because Mariela is as honest a person in the space as I know, and I love her that she's candid and honest. And so what in this space is a message that you think is counterproductive?
That we're going to fix homelessness, that all of a sudden mental health is just, we're never going to see it again on the streets, that like we're going to just solve world peace. The same message that started happening with cops. Yeah. Right? A cop is going to do all of these things. Let's just call 911 because it's going to save us. I think that there is something to be said as we're starting to see, we've now evaluated, right, many programs. We've seen them work. They're successful based on what we built them to do. Right. Divert calls from police and help people get to a better space that's not death. Right? That's not like a force issue. That's not like a leave them on the street issue. That's not like a place that keeps them worse off. That's just the reality. I mean, I want to say it, like the catalyst for these programs was George Floyd. It was a very public moment. Now, do I think that there was additional reasons? Absolutely. But the catalyst that shoved us into it was that year where we were seeing a lot more of that, and it was very public. But the whole idea is that, again, we get people to a better place. What we've started to see and what we call moral injury is when we have nowhere to take these people. Yeah. We've got very little detox beds. The hospitals are just discharging them as soon as they see them. They're like, nope, you're out. Yep. Right? The jails are already at capacity. And so they're like, we don't have any space for these folks.
And we're don't have the resources that they should have.
Yeah, the list goes on. We can't get people housed. The list goes on. And so we're starting to see more and more where alternatives are having to push, be a catalyst, or like places like Durham, who have just decided to take it all into their own department, which is going to be fascinating to watch. But it's definitely the area that I think is really a struggle. And then I also will say that the secondary piece that's coming up more as a message and less of a solution is that there is now a little bit of competition, I'll say, or maybe rub between the different types of, right? We see mobile crisis teams, very defined type of response, where they're like, well, this is what we do. And we're like, but that's not what you're doing, right? It's a very different approach. And so trying to call us mobile crisis is in my eyes contradictory until we actually broaden out that definition and creates different types of standards that aren't necessarily based on what the mobile crisis team is set up to do right now today. So that has been a conflict because as you've seen, even at the convening we had in New York this last year, we had mobile crisis teams there that were like, I can't believe you don't do forms. And we were like, we don't have time for forms. Yeah. We have time for trying to build rapport and get somebody the help that they need.
Right. Yeah. I feel like every 6 months I come up with a new myth that it needs to be busted, right? And that is the latest thing that I keep talking about is no matter how much we scale up first response, it's a piece of a larger puzzle of a continuum. And I can have 2,000 more cops in Seattle, and it will not look different, in my opinion, if the jails are inadequate to actually help people, if I don't have a behavioral health system, if I don't have that through line into housing for the crisis population, but then into stability. And so it's funny, I spend most of my time advocating for things that are actually outside of my scope of work because I know it's all for naught. I'm trying to actually help the individual. And we're just talking about that from the 911 call, what happens. But I like the idea, mobile crisis. I love the idea of care navigation, that 30-day follow-up, or if you do need to spend 4 hours on a call, is there a unit that I can hand off to? But I want to go back to the risk factor. This is why I'm so convicted about that first responder integrated CAD status. It's because if care responders or ACS, if they start to approach and they realize that something was not known, in dispatch, they can radio. They can call fast backup exactly the same way that fire does. And I feel like it is imperative. When you hand these teams off, or the calls off to a team that does not have that, there's significant risk. And then the other thing that I sometimes say, what if a social worker gets shot? I'm like, what if a social worker gets shot? We have gun violence all over this country. First responders are harmed in the line of duty all the time. It would not discredit the movement should that happen. I don't want it to happen. We're designing against it. But that is such a false premise. It's such an excuse to not do something that is right.
Yeah, and when balanced against the fire department responds unarmed to calls
all the time.
All the time, daily. They are very occasionally assaulted, so it's not as though it is not a thing, but nobody says we can't send the fire department without police because once in a blue moon, somebody... Yeah. But much like fire assesses a situation as folks are responding and coming in, once it appears to be, this might be a violent circumstance, then they back away, call the police, and there's no reason that isn't also the case for alternative response.
Yeah.
Well, and look at the training. Cops go through weeks and weeks and weeks of training and still have incidents that go wrong. It's going to happen. And it's one of the things that I early on had to have the conversation with the administration that the minute somebody gets hurt, which somebody did, someone got shot while they were helping homeless people with a BB gun. Thank God, because how it came across the radio was shots fired. And that's it was like the worst moment in my life. But I thought they didn't even see it coming, right? They were with they were outreach workers. I mean, they weren't even on like a behavioral health 911 call. This was just working with homeless people. And it happened to other city employees around the city who were also helping. We can't always control it, but we can start to figure out how to meet that, right? We know we have to pay our first responders good money, right? We know we need to have things in place, right? Thank God fire and police have already done this work for us. Like, are we contributing to good behavioral health, assistance, right? You guys have 24/7 hotlines for cops who can call if they need help or they're in crisis. We have the same, right? We have a 20-hour in-house therapist at ACS that I thought was really important because you never know how you're going to process something or what's going to trigger you. And so I think that those are the things, right? How we work with our unions, how we think about keeping people safe, and then how are we messaging? After that incident, the first thing I did was call my comms person, say, I want you to create a behind the scenes. I want a whole comms on if somebody was hurt, if somebody is shot, if somebody is stabbed. I want it all. I want the whole gamut so that if we're ever in that situation, we're not scrambling.
The crisis communications.
You got to communicate well, and you have to be ready for understanding what that protocol is going to look like. This is hard work. Yeah. Social workers have been in bad situations before. Is it a lot? Absolutely not. But when it happens, it will be a big news situation. It will make people say, I told you. But again, how we message and how we control that is going to be really like helpful if we're ready and not scrambling.
And I think what people also need to understand. What was that?
That's what me and Amy are prepared to do.
I like it. You guys are both leaders in the space. The one thing that I want to emphasize here for folks is that alternative response is not valued just because it frees up officers to do more law enforcement. We're really looking for better outcomes and a better resolution for the client, whoever the client is, whoever the person in need is. If we can deal with that person more effectively, get them into services that break cycles, it's an overall reduction in public disorder and an increase in an advancement for public safety, and that's what we're looking for.
I should marry that guy. That was really good.
If your grandma gets lost, do you really want to how do we actually find somebody who understands dementia and Alzheimer's? It's not going to be like, hey, stop, old lady, right? That we can take the time to go and try to help this woman and then give them resources.
That's not how you do it? I'm just a cop. I don't know. I don't know how these things work.
Yeah. No, I do think it is an important framing. I'm like, just match the discipline. It's not about staffing or staffing shortages. It's what discipline is most expert. We were cracking up yesterday. I was in a meeting where I was like, okay, can we be clear that 8 hours of CIT training is not the equivalent of all of these degrees and 20 years of experience in a clinical field, right? It's not the same thing. I mean, we can upskill, but only to a certain extent. They're just different disciplines.
We're pretty smart, though, cops.
Yeah,
we are. We're fantastic. But we can't be specialists in everything. That's the point. The point is that to actually break cycles and to get folks stabilized and to get them so that they don't continue to be recidivist and high utilizers, we need to employ the best people possible to impact that circumstance.
Yeah. It's one of the running jokes between us is walking down the street, what I am trained to see and look for, and what he's trained to see and look for.
I'm still wondering.
He thinks I'm delusional, but it is interesting because, again, back to the professional disciplines, we are trained to be optimists, to look for possibility, to look for, again, what is the in? How can you have a collaborative conversation? And it is entirely different than what law enforcement is trained to look for. And both are incredibly valid. There's a leader up here in SPD that I love who runs the clinical side of the co-response team. And the first time we spoke, they said, Amy, make no mistake, cops are expert in human behavior. It's just different than your expertise. It's just, and I've thought about that ever since, because it is true. He sees so many things.
I see any potential threat, and Amy does not.
Yeah.
But
as I'm walking around, he's always moving me from side to side.
She does too, but this with a little bit of a different lens. We see it too. I mean, you've been doing it forever, Eric. I mean, at some point it can feel, and I think it's one of the challenges, and I worry a little bit about, because we haven't hit it quite yet, right? A lot of our teams across the nation are hurting because they're like, I don't have anywhere to take people. But what I also see very slowly is that I also don't want people to start getting jaded. Like, Bob is an addict and Bob won't let me help him. And Bob, this is the 25th time I've seen Bob. And I'm like, you got to remember, like, this is about meeting people where they're at. And I think that can feel... That can feel hard, right? Especially when you've got public perception that's like, these people don't do anything. Yeah. They don't get anybody off the street. And it's like, we have to let people make choices, and we have to treat people with dignity and respect to let them do that. So it's just hard. But I agree. I will tell you, the longer I did it, the more I was like, had a heightened sense of a lot of different things. And I was like, man, I now see that, and I wish I didn't.
Yeah. So, and I will say, again, the caveat, I am not a first responder, right? So it's interesting when I'm out with the care team, how much they are seeing things in a similar way. They are absolutely trained to be assessing threat all the time. It is very interesting to articulate the difference between these folks who are trained in first response and perhaps have a clinical background and lens versus a traditional social worker. So I love Dr. Amy Watson, people like that really looking at it.
It's street smart, some of it, right? Some of my team are really on it, or some of the team, I shouldn't say my team. I'm still wearing old hats that I shouldn't be. But, a lot of the folks that we worked with were just really smart about like what to do, not because they had the training, but because they're like, I live these streets. I know not to go down that street. I know I'm not going to go put myself in that. So don't approach that tent.
Yeah.
Not because they got the training, but because they just know.
Yeah. So what's the thing that you, as we work towards wrapping this up, what's the thing you want folks to know? Like this movement is, this train's left the station, and this is so attractive to jurisdictions across the globe because of the potential to actually interrupt cycles and change people's lives and reduce the ongoing burden on the system. What is it that you want folks to know?
Well, I think I would love for people to know that this field of practice exists. It's not going anywhere. Are we still trying to figure out who lives in it and like how big is this house? Absolutely. And I'm hoping that every time we have, gatherings like we had in New York and with practitioners and researchers and funders, that we get a little bit more aligned on what that means. Are we going to lose some folks in the process? Probably. Will we not necessarily work with them in the future? That's not true, right? I think that there's this really amazing ecosystem that we're still trying to figure out. And so I say this more for people who are like, it's just a fad. It's not. I think we've got really smart, intelligent solution makers. Amy and Eric have been huge on this as we think about big time thinking. And so I do think this is moving. The second thing I will say is that this is a little bit different, right? And I think that there's a place in the movement in regards to CBI work. So I do want to touch on it, because people will say, well, that's different. It is different. It's a whole different field. It's what they do, how they do the work. Do I think the alignment and figuring out how to help each other out and be there for each other is extremely important, because they offer something that we don't in a very special way, and vice versa. And so I do think that there's going to be some alignment with other groups, just like it is with police, right? We don't do what police does.
Yeah, I think it's an ancillary. Yeah, community violence interruption is ancillary, as are so many other things, and to include the fire department, to include the police department. But I think you guys are carving out space as a first responder, which is a little bit different than CVI stuff.
Very different.
But there's overlap, right? It's a Venn diagram, right?
Yep. And it's just like you guys have specialty teams, at the police department. You have your gang related team. So I will say that I think the big thing is, how do we continue to support this for those that are watching, that want to be involved, that are starting to think about workforce. There's a new workforce that we are training up, that we are working with, that are looking at this for a long-term job, not just in the short term. So I do think that people who maybe are like, I don't have anything to do with first response. No, you do, right? Your data systems, your cars, your equipment, everything that we sell to police, that is literally where we're headed in the case of this type of new first response. And so it's going to be extremely, it'll take us a little bit of time, but just like what we said, 5 years was not a lot of time. It feels like a lot, but I think that we're going to have this figured out. I would say 2 to 3 years, maybe sooner.
Well, I think it's important to note that you were starting from an idea, right? And so to have, having just attended an international conference on this 5 years later with, 250 attendees from all over the globe. I mean, this thing is caught fire. It is going to continue to grow, and it's understandable that 4 or 5 years in, you don't have every answer to every question. But even when you're seasoned and veteran, the police department continues to iterate. The fire department continues to iterate. You'll iterate over time. But I already think that and there's still some debates on what's best practice in all of those fields, just like there will continue to be in alternative response. So I think you guys have come miles and miles and miles in a very short period of time, and look forward to the continued iteration. And I love the opportunity to continue to watch you two powerhouses
arm wrestle everyone
go at it.
in the industry.
So it's fun stuff. Anything to close out, Ames?
We're coming to Albuquerque. We're coming to the Safety of Our Cities conference. We're going to present together. I need to go back to the RTCC, because, Peregrine is one of the more interesting technologies right now that we're looking at. I keep saying we've got to get the public safety and public health data together. You just have to, if we're going to actually help people and track people through the system. So everything
is siloed, from a data perspective. To your point, data and cars and communications and all those things, all those factors. But, knowledge is power, and having information on the high utilizer that you're talking to at any juncture, whether it be police, whether it be fire, whether it be community-based organizations, whether it be a CARE or ACS, having the knowledge of what that person's history is and how they best respond to circumstances, that's money in the bank. And so Peregrine, obviously, who I'm associated with to help represent, is data at your fingertips to know what you can know about this person to best intervene in the situation that you're dealing with. So in any case, thank you so much, Mariela. I didn't get you to curse or throw your hands in the air. I was trying, but you kept it all together. You kept me at bay.
Because she's out of politics.
Well, I appreciate you guys. No, I really appreciate you guys. It's always it's always nice to be able to be around folks that I think are living in the same space and understand the issues and always thinking outside the box. It's how we're going to get to the next phase of this.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Let's see you in person soon.
All right. Now, people don't know this. You've been bombarded in the past. It just hasn't been recorded. So anyway, thanks for participating in our podcast. Have a good one.
Thank you.
The Bombardened podcast is a Barden Squared production. Executive producers are Eric Barden and Amy Barden, and video and audio production of the Bombardened podcast is by Thread Theory Creative.